Great. Thank you so much, Alex. Wonderful to have you all today. My name is Hemali Bhashyam. I'm an associate director at Social Finance. And welcome to the panel on mobilizing donor-advised funds towards impact investments. So I see that Alex has already launched the poll. One of the things we'd love to do is just understand who our audience is. So if you could sort of fill that out over the next couple minutes, that would be super helpful. About a year ago, with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, Social Finance, which is a nonprofit pay for success intermediary with the mission to unlock more capital for social progress, we launched some market research to better understand how to unlock more DAF capital for impact investments. And today, I'm excited to be sharing some of those insights on that research on DAF sponsor and donor psychology, the challenges and opportunities that we face in connecting DAF capital to impact investments. And then we have a number of really great panelists here to provide some tangible examples from their experiences in the field. And we have a packed agenda, so we'll start quickly with introductions. I will share some high-level findings from our market research, and then we'll go into the panel discussion, which will be sort of the meat of the discussion for today, and end with some Q&A, and we'll try to give folks about 15 minutes at least to ask some questions. So feel free to drop those into the chat throughout. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be made available online later. So with that, I'm really thrilled to join my panelists. We have Susan, Bert, James, and Tanya, who bring a wealth of experience in the DAF space, all of whom who have in some capacity been working on and thinking about impact investing through their DAF. So thank you all so much for joining today. Would you mind sharing a quick 30-second introduction about yourself? Maybe we can start with Susan.
Sure, thank you, Hemali. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you all for joining. I work at Fidelity Charitable. We are a donor-advised fund sponsor, and my role at Fidelity Charitable is specifically to work directly with donors and their advisors on mobilizing their philanthropic capital in their account for strategic and effective grant making. I've been at Fidelity Charitable for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was a major gift fundraiser at the School of Business at Duke. And prior to that, I had a couple of different roles with different organizations in the financial services industry, specifically focused on fixed income instruments. And I'm very happy to be here and excited to hear all the great contributions of the rest of the panelists.
Thanks, Susan. Bert, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Burke Floyce, formerly with Silicon Valley Community Foundation, where I headed up investments and was a champion and advocate for impact investing for well over a decade now. Now I'm doing consulting work for a variety of asset managers, family foundations, community foundations. So I look forward to the conversation.
James?
Hi, my name is James Cutler with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. I'm the Senior Investment Officer for the foundation. My background started in traditional investment management and financial services, moved into nonprofit service, and finally ended with, most recently, some work in community development banking and access to financial services. I work with the foundation to manage our investments and integrate our capital to be more mission aligned and get more money into the communities that need it most. Thanks.
Wonderful. And Tanya, you're last but not least.
Hi, I'm Tanya Shadoan, and I'm with the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund in San Francisco. I came out of the financial services world as well. I worked for more than 20 years for Citibank, largely in consumer banking, but also in the Chief Innovation Office. I've been with the Federation now about 1.5 years, and I'm responsible for philanthropy operations and impact investing, which we are getting off the ground. This has been a priority for us for about the past year, really kind of early days. In terms of our DAF portfolio, we have about 1,100 DAFs and 32 or so supporting organizations, about $2 billion under management. And we're really excited to be starting to venture into impact investing as a way to create new opportunities for our DAF holders.
Okay, thank you all. So we already did this poll, but it looks like majority of the folks sort of fall in the other category, and then we have a few people sprinkled throughout. I know Alex had just shared the results of that with you all earlier. So that's really very helpful to know that, that we have a good number of folks who are not as familiar with, or could not be as familiar with the DAF space. So we'll keep that in mind. So I'll start with a bit of an overview on DAFs, share a little bit of our market research, and then we'll go into the Q&A and the panel discussion as I mentioned. So for those who are less familiar with the donor-advised funds, the donor-advised funds are DAFs. DAFs are a vehicle by which donors can make a charitable contribution that can grow over time. And contributions are usually held in an account, a DAF, managed by a public charity, often referred to as staff sponsors, which sort of manages the administrative tasks associated with those assets. And those assets are eventually largely deployed in two different ways, either as payouts or grants to nonprofit organizations as contributions, or as investments in the market. And as we sort of think about the current state of DAFs, there's about $120 billion in total, and only about 20% of that is currently going towards charitable donations, where social outcomes are considered or contributed to, as you can sort of see here on the left axis. Meanwhile, about 80% of the DAF assets are currently passively invested in the market, with little to no attention to sort of the social outcomes that were sort of the main attribution. So one of the main objectives for us is to think about how can we shift more of that capital that is passively invested into a third bucket in the realm of impact investing, where we can sort of achieve both social and financial return. And I think there's really no better time than now to be thinking about how we can leverage more of DAFs during this, the economic, health, social sort of crisis that we're encountering with COVID-19 and a number of other sort of crises that we're experiencing short-term, long-term. Over the past few years, there's been an increasing attention on DAFs. Some of it being the overall structure of DAFs being criticized for, and I quote, stacking up on cash. And we believe that now is the time to really harness that capital for greater good via impact investing. And here you can see just some of the headlines that we've kind of brought in that sort of talk about the need for DAFs and how can they be deployed more widely. And impact investing can actually be a really great tool. But really the question is, how can we do it at scale? And so as part of our first phase of our work, we really wanted to better understand the demand for from donors, from sponsors, and the psychology of those stakeholders, and the pipeline of the available opportunity as we think about the world of DAFs and how do we connect them to impact investments. On the capital side, we interviewed around 20 plus sponsoring organizations and conducted a donor survey with over 250 donors. And what we found was that there was tremendous amounts of interest in impact investing. About 70% of all donors indicated interest with willingness to allocate nearly 20% of their assets to make new contributions to their DAFs. And what was interesting was in this research was that these donors were willing to actually take on more concessionary returns and less liquid investments as part of their interest in impact investments. We also learned that younger donors were increasingly more interested in impact investing. And that trend is going to continue going forward, especially as young donors are entering into and learning more about DAFs going forward. On the pipeline side, on the right-hand side, what we learned as part of our research was that there is actually a plethora of number of opportunities to invest in. About $24 billion worth of robust pipeline of opportunities. I think what we also learned is that finding and curating and diligencing these opportunities is oftentimes very resource intensive. And sponsors don't always have the in-house capacity to do this type of legwork on their own. For the recipient organization that's receiving this capital, the DAF capital provides the flexible, catalytic, low-cost capital that they can often leverage to leverage for even more capital. For institutional capital, as an example, your $10 million can actually lead to $20 million more in institutional capital that can come in, because your the DAF capital can be more flexible, it's lower cost, could be in the form of a recoverable grant. So I think with that, what we found is that there's this untapped demand to connect that DAF capital to impact investment opportunities. Oftentimes when we structure it as a recoverable grant, it helps increase payout rates of sponsoring organizations. And currently, you know, there are a number of platforms that exist that actually do this, but there remains an opportunity to really connect more the DAF capital to impact first investment opportunities, with less than 2% of the market share currently being captured by incumbent players. There's really white space here to grow. So with that, our research was really informative, and we've now launched into sort of the second phase of work. We're working on pilots with two of the DAF sponsors that you know, here are panelists for us, Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the Jewish Community Federation Endowment Fund of San Francisco. And what we're looking to do is really roll up our sleeves and work with our partners to bring this vision to life, to mobilize more DAF capital for impact investments. We're really focused in on CDFIs, and you know, I'm really excited to start to question the panelists we have on here about some of the work that we're doing with them. But you know, we're really focusing on these community development financial institutions in the Bay Area, as both of these organizations are focused in on the Bay Area. And we're honing in on issues that are related to sort of the priorities of the sponsoring organizations and the donors, largely in the context of COVID. So focusing in on small business lending, affordable housing, environment. And so we're really, as we look to continue and launch these pilots, we're looking to package these opportunities in a way that donors can easily understand, and that that our pilot partners can easily execute at the end of the day. As part of that, we have this sort of aggressive timeline, and with a goal to actually go live in November with a number of work streams that we're working on. So from platform development to pipeline to donor engagement. And as part of that, we're doing a number of focus groups to actually understand what are some of the behavioral science nudges that we can test to see how can we get donors to be more interested in allocating more DAF capital through recoverable grants or impact loans. And we're also thinking about is there a business model for this, and can we capture these learnings for scale? At the end of the day, this is about taking what we're learning and sharing with the larger field, and being able to set the standards that can really push the field forward. So we're currently, as we're in September, we're looking to launch in the next couple of months, and have been working across all these sort of work streams to really push this forward, and we're excited to share our learnings broadly. But with that, I'd love to open this up to our panelists, and we have a number of great questions for our panelists. So we'll sort of dive right in. I think for everyone here, I'd love to start to hearing from each of you. So we'll start with, why do this? We know that creating a robust, compelling impact investment offering for DAF donors is not easy. And we also know from our research that DAF sponsors approach this space with very different aspirations. What was the impetus behind each of your organizations getting into this impact investing in the first place? So maybe we'll start with in the same order that we have in the slide here. And Susan, we can go with you first.
Sure, thank you. Fidelity Charitable first launched our foray into offering impact investing opportunities to our donors about 5 years ago. We did that by sort of going slowly, by dipping the toe in the water by offering pools that were representing underlying mutual funds for sustainable investing. These primarily were screened funds as opposed to intentional ESG guided opportunities. The answer to your question as to why was really gets to the whole core of how we develop our programs and offerings at Fidelity Charitable in the first place. We have had many conversations with donors who have both private foundations and donor-advised fund assets at Fidelity Charitable, as well as talking with advisors and trying to get the pulse on what they were hearing from their clients with regard to investing generally. We have seen sort of a merging of philanthropy with investment objectives. And so that was really the driver. We realized there was a growing trend toward an interest in doing more with DAF assets than just traditional investing opportunities. And that's why we opened it up initially to just funds. And now we have a much broader array of offerings off our platform.
Bert, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think the impetus at Silicon Valley Community Foundation was a confluence of a number of factors. First was, and I'm going back to 2007 when the foundation was formed from the merger of two neighboring community foundations. So one was my personal interest and commitment to this space. Back when it was the more for mission movement to, what about the other 95% of your assets, to get foundations to use their investment capital for good, not just 5%. That really resonated with me, made a lot of sense that we're not going to solve global problems with philanthropic capital alone. So that was part of it. And so I was an internal champion and force pushing that message. Second was accommodating the donors who were interested in this. After the financial crisis, there was, I think, greater interest in looking at other avenues for mobilizing all the tools available, all the capital available. So we started a handful of donor families who brought opportunities and really wanted help getting those done. And I'm grateful to those initial families who, we learned together and as Susan said, dipped our toe in the water and began the journey. Two other factors were, again, following the financial crisis, there was a real interest strategically to diversify revenue sources and not have only dependent on asset-based revenues that swing with the market fluctuation. Following the pain of having to do layoffs in 2008, really motivated that. So this was an opportunity to provide new services in response to donor interest. And then last, I'd say it fit well with the foundation's value proposition and kind of growing reputation of handling complex assets and very custom high net worth philanthropic interests. So over time, those factors came together to drive greater and greater interest organizationally and at the board level.
Anything you'd want to add, James? I know you guys are representing the same organization.
Yeah, thanks. I think Bert did a great job overviewing the Silicon Valley Community Foundation's journey. I would just frame it, what Bert mentioned is really we have, two capital sources, our own endowment and our donors, as well as the community that we serve. So we have three stakeholders at the table. And in the beginning, not all three stakeholders wanted impact investing. And it took individuals like Bert who were champions to really push for this and bring it to the table and educate others. But now I think we're in a moment where all three stakeholders are at the table saying, impact investing is what we need. Our community is saying our traditional financial models and economic systems not working for us. We need more capital and we need it in different ways and different terms. Our donors are saying, I don't want to look at my donations and my investments as two separate entities. They're really one and the same operation. How do I make sure my investments are aligned with my charitable mission? And our board and our staff and our leadership are asking those same questions, saying, what does SVCF do with our own capital? And how do our investments align with what we want to do? And what impact do they have? So I think, currently in this moment now, we are in a place where we have all three stakeholders really involved in the community foundation, all pushing for impact investing as, the logical next step of saying, what do we do with this money that we have, and how does it achieve our mission, and how do we make more impact in our communities?
Okay. Tanya?
So I would say at the Jewish Community Federation, our impact investing journey really started with our Jewish values, Kehila, Tzedakah, Tzedek, and Tikkun Olam, which represents a focus on community, justice, giving with just intention, and repairing the world. All of those things are obviously needed now more than ever. So we started with our Jewish values, which really guide everything we do. And then we started thinking about the fact that all of this staff capital, of which there is a tremendous amount, is irrevocably committed to philanthropy, yet only 10 to 15% of it on average is actually granted out in a given year. So that meant that 80 to 90% of these assets that were irrevocably committed to philanthropy were not actually doing anything philanthropic. Obviously, there is a benefit to investment for return. The money, capital preservation is important, and the ability to continue to have the funds into the future. But the needs are growing now. Again, nobody needs to be told that. There's more and more need, and we have the capital to solve some of these problems. So the idea was, could we bring together our values and this notion of this money has already been committed and do something more with it? One of the things that has been really appealing is this idea of recyclability. And maybe I'll save that for a later question, but the idea of using this money more than one time is really resonating. So I'll leave it at that. Keep moving.
Great, thank you all. And so it's really nice to hear from all the three sort of snapshots across these sponsor organizations around why you're doing it. Bert, I'll sort of jump to you and ask to get your perspective on over this sort of time and historical period of from when we first started thinking about impact investing and how it's translated over into DAF. What have been some of the trends that you've seen in the impact investing space through DAF, and how do you see this specific moment that we're in right now, especially in the context of COVID, influencing how DAF capital is deployed for impact?
Yeah, so a couple of trends. One, over a very long arc, and I alluded to this earlier, is that the field of impact investing going from a movement to a legitimate and recognized field of practice. I'm recalling a report by the Monitor Group, over a decade ago, saying that moving through typical phases of industry maturation and looking at microfinance as a model that took 30 years to evolve, that there's enough investment into the infrastructure now by some of the visionaries and pioneers, Ford, MacArthur, Rockefeller, Skoll, Midyar, Heron, who helped nurture this ecosystem and fund the infrastructure, that now the big players are coming in to capitalize on that. So that's one macro trend, over time, that I think we'll continue to see play out. That said, there's still a lot of infrastructure building that needs to be done that I'm sure we'll get to later. Another is, and James alluded to this, is community foundations. I think, kind of waking up that donor advised funds are capital, but how do you utilize them? We've got to partner with our donors. We have to look at the local regions we serve, and we need to partner with CDFIs and other local players to utilize that capital for good. So that's a clear trend, and I don't see that stopping. More recent, over the last 5 years, while I was at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and James is experiencing this still, is there was a year-over-year increase in both the number of donors wanting to make and recommending impact investments and the volume from those donors. So we've seen tremendous donor demand really blossom over the last 5 years. And then I think the trend that I'm excited about is what our friends at Social Finance are doing with this pilot, and the folks at CapShift are doing by providing a platform and ways to match donor interest with investable opportunities, and to reduce the friction for the DAF sponsors to connect those pipes and let that capital flow, to its highest purpose.
Thanks, Bert. So Susan, we'll jump over to you. And in your role, you engage with donors quite a bit. So talk to us about how trends in donor psychology towards impact investments has changed. For example, how are donors thinking about these opportunities, and what are their motivations for getting involved, and how do you see that evolving?
Yeah, we have seen a tremendous increase in interest in impact investing, but I think a lot of it is still confusing for many of our donors. But fortunately, I think through educational resources that are out there, advisors are becoming more familiar and speaking to their clients. We are seeing a growing interest. And I think one of the trends specifically is, particularly for those donors who are really new to the space, wanting to not go it alone, but rather to take advantage of some collaborative opportunities. We see that both in a grant making context as well as a strict investment context. And I think that's an important bifurcation to make, because when it relates to donor advised funds, there is this philanthropic capital that is being invested, and I think we'll get into more specific types of investment opportunities with those funds. But there's also the philanthropic investment through the grant making activity of the donor. And so in my conversation with donors, I have seen a lot of them, particularly matriarchs and patriarchs of families, starting to engage the next generation, and even in some cases G2, G3, where their values and mission may be a little bit different than the original founders of the philanthropic sources of funds for the family. And so this broadens the conversation. And I think the growth in the whole topic of the transition in philanthropic capital being moved over to generation 2 and 3, in the next 5 to 10 years, is really driving a huge interest in the space. So basically, we're seeing a lot of donors listening to the next generation. We're seeing a lot of donors who are talking to their peers and realizing there is an opportunity to align their values with both their grant making and their investment with regard to their philanthropic capital.
Thanks, Susan. We'll jump over to Tanya to talk a little bit more about sort of specific offerings. Tanya, you mentioned that the Federation sees impact investing as a way to get capital, from the sidelines to more impact. And to do that at scale is going to require a lot of the tools in the toolbox that you can possibly imagine. So what are the different impact investing tools that you've used at the Federation, and how do you position each of these to your donors?
Thanks, Hemali. So we are starting very simple. We understand and recognize that there's a lot of education that needs to happen, and our goal is to educate our funders and engage them, bring them into opportunities. So that's why we're starting simple. We've started with 2 different impact opportunities. One is an impact loan to agencies in our community, and the other is a recoverable grant. They're actually quite similar. The way we're viewing them a little bit differently is an impact loan has a rate of return, could be considered an alternative to money market investment, and then a recoverable grant would be more of a grant that's made more like a charitable grant, but with the expectation that some or all of it could be repaid in the future, but it's not actually transacted necessarily as a direct loan. We're still working through the nuances of these different vehicles, but the idea is that we want people to see the opportunity, to trust us that we're curating and bringing to them interesting opportunities that will make a difference, making it easy for them, giving them the education and the disclosures that they need to understand what's the risk level, how does this work, what's the impact on my liquidity, who does it benefit. So again, the education is really, really critical. We're also giving them the chance to be convened and pool their funds together. We find this very exciting. It's a way to essentially work as a community and choose opportunities that matter, that we care about, and then support them as a group. It's not one-off, whereas grant making can generally be very individual. People have personal priorities and goals, and they individually make the decisions about where to put the funds. In this case, as a community organization, we're curating opportunities and bringing our funders together. And that's actually very exciting because it creates the power of the group, the ability to pool all of these different assets together and make an even bigger impact because we're doing it together. So I would say that's the other really big part of this, is whether we call it an impact loan or a recoverable grant, either way, we're pooling funds from across multiple different funders, and that allows us to create greater impact as an overall group than each of us would be able to do individually.
Could you actually elaborate as well, Tanya, about impact loans and specifically your story around the Hebrew Free Loan Fund that you did?
Absolutely. So back in March, in the early days of this COVID crisis, we saw in one of our agencies in the community, the Hebrew Free Loan Agency, they were getting an unprecedented demand for new loans into the community that they had just never seen at this level before. With shelter in place, businesses closing, unemployment skyrocketing, more and more people were coming forward with a need to borrow money. And they saw that they were not going to be able to meet that need alone. So they approached us at the Federation and they said, could we do something together in partnership to create a larger pool that could respond to these needs in COVID? Within a matter of 2 weeks' time, we were able to get an offering together, a recoverable grant, marketed out to the community, and we got 53 funders to commit almost $5 million to Hebrew Free Loan to allow them to make new COVID loans into the community at this time of critical need. So since April, we have been working with Hebrew Free Loan, who has been processing these loan applications and putting the money out into the community. Almost all of it has been loaned out so far in these past few months, and some of the money is starting to be repaid, which is actually a wonderful thing because in a short period of time, we've been able to show our funders that the money goes out and the money comes back in again. It meets an urgent need and then it comes back in again. So it's also about building trust, that when we bring these opportunities to our funders, we can not only give them exciting new ways to help that they hadn't otherwise thought of, we can do it in a seamless way that makes it very easy for them. And we show them in a short amount of time that it's actually working and their capital comes back into their DAFs and can be used again. This is the recoverable aspect I mentioned a few minutes ago. The idea that when you make a charitable grant, it goes out and it's gone forever. Doing good, absolutely, but you don't have the chance to touch that money again. With a recoverable grant or an impact loan, what's really resonating with people is I can use this money today, and then in a year or 3 years or 5 years, whatever the term is, the money will be back in my fund and I can redeploy it. I can redeploy it for another impact opportunity, or I can put it into a charitable grant. I have options and I have the ability to make different choices at different points in time. That has been very, very exciting for people to think about. I think that hadn't been on their radar prior to this.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Tanya. James, I'd love to come to you and ask you around how does SCCF think about these different impact investing offerings, and where do recoverable grants fit into your portfolio, and what prompted you to expand this offering?
Yeah, thanks, Hemali. Silicon Valley Community Foundation has been doing impact investing for a number of years now, mostly in a donor-driven manner. Our donors came to us and said, here's an organization, here's a cause, here's a company, here's an opportunity that I would like to fund. And we were able to engage our donors and do equity investments, debt investments, convertible investments, recoverable grants, the full spectrum of impact investing as kind of a customized service for donors who knew what the opportunities that they wanted and were able to bring them to us. So what we're doing now is saying, how do we take those learnings? How do we take our history and really think through what are all of those different tools, from regular grants, recoverable grants, loans, convertible notes, equity, guarantees, the full spectrum of capital. What are all those tools? How do we use each one? When is each one appropriate? And then package them together so we can now bring this to our donors. So the change being, previously our donors are bringing us opportunities. We're using that learning and turning around now being able to offer our donors, to lead our donors down the path of impact investing, showing our donors these are opportunities that we have vetted. These are opportunities that we believe in. Here's examples of how you use these tools, and we can now begin to lead our donors down the path of impact investing. Recoverable grants fit into that spectrum as a unique tool to, as Tanya mentioned, be able to put money out into the community, but then also be able to bring it back. And part of the pilot and the great work that we're doing with you in social finance is really defining what is a recoverable grant and what is an impact loan and what are all of these different tools that we have used along the way. So we're asking our accountants, recoverable grants and what is a loan? Should we hold it on our books as a receivable? Should we keep it as an expense? We're asking our attorneys, what is a recoverable grant as a loan? Can we collect it? Can we enforce it? What happens if they don't pay? We're asking our investment staff, like myself, what is the due diligence process on each? How do we feel the risk? Is this a high risk or low risk? What information should we be asking of the grantees? What information should we be presenting the donors? So we're taking our previous history of making customized investments and trying to bring them all together into a uniform program which we can present to our donors and offer them as a way for them to get started, really lowering the bar of what it takes to get involved in impact investing, coupling all the technical knowledge with the education and with the resources necessary to do so.
That's super helpful. I'd love to actually also ask Susan a similar question. Susan, as the largest staff sponsor in the country, what does it take to mobilize that capital towards impact investments at scale? And I think the big question a lot of people have is how, right? What does it take from Fidelity's standpoint to actually deploy? How do you do that due diligence? How do you sort of make sure that the accounting takes place in the back end and do it in a way that's efficient?
The way that we approach impact investing, and I'll use recoverable grants as an example since that has been discussed previously, we first started doing recoverable grants about 4 years ago. Since 2016, I think we've put a little over 16 million into these types of structures. And as a donor advised fund sponsor, these assets that are going out of donor advised fund accounts, because they have to be going to operating 501c3 institutions, we have been doing recoverable grants with nonprofit organizations in a variety of ways. One of the first ones that we did was with a donor who actually sat on the board of a nonprofit. This is an organization that actually deploys capital out to social entrepreneurs, not specifically those engaged in nonprofit activities exclusively. There are for-profit social entrepreneurs as well. And it turned out that this particular organization was going to the capital markets to privately raise capital for purposes of their operations. And my donor wanted to participate as an investment, but he had a very short time frame within which he could engage this opportunity. And so I knew that there was no way that we would be able to get through our diligence on the investment opportunity, which generally takes anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the stage of the investment and the availability of documentation, access to attorneys, et cetera. But instead, we wrote a recoverable grant that mirrored the terms in the private placement memorandum. And this particular recoverable grant had a spread over 6-month treasuries. It was written for a 3-year term. And of course, as I said, the proceeds of the grant itself went to fund social entrepreneurs through the nonprofit organization. What happened at the end of the 3-year term at maturity is the donor decided to roll it over. So we actually extended the recoverable grant. Of course, the markets have changed and the spread over treasuries got a little bit skinnier. But from an accounting perspective, what we do at Fidelity Charitable is that any return back into the donor's DAF account through this spread over treasuries, every 6 months it was coming in, we treat it as a return of principal. Being a recoverable grant, there is no guarantee the money will come back into Fidelity Charitable's DonorAdvised Fund account of the donor. So we basically treat any income coming back as a return of principal. And at the end, we have seen proceeds returned in full. Not all recoverable grants have a rate of return. Not all of the returns that are there are necessarily at market, but some are. Some of these actual opportunities not only come from donors in a one-off situation like I just described, but they also come in a collaborative way, much as Bert has described. It comes in a way that through, we mentioned CapShift, also Calvert Impact Capital. There's a lot going on because of COVID in trying to rebuild business communities, and the deployment of capital through CDFIs have been mentioned. So we are participating alongside with our donors who come to us and say, can I participate in these types of investments? And we've gotten to a yes. So that is very, very exciting. Not all donors are ready to go into in a collaborative way. They may start their impact investing journey by investing in mutual funds or ETFs, either through their advisor or through the pools available to them through Fidelity Charitable's offering. We also participate in social impact bonds through fixed income opportunities that investment advisors can invest the charitable assets through the managed account. So a variety of ways and some really interesting opportunities. A specific one, I'll be brief in this storytelling, but it's COVID specific and it's a great story. I have a donor in Oregon who wanted to continue funding an organization, a human services organization he and his family had been involved with for years, and they had an opportunity to buy a land parcel adjacent to where their building currently is. They had actually obtained from the state of Oregon some funding, and in light of COVID and all of the stretched resources as a result of municipalities not getting the tax revenues, et cetera, the state put a pause on their distribution of these funds to this organization. In the meantime, the parcel of land came up for sale, and my donor stepped in and said, hey, what can I do? How can I use my philanthropic capital to help this nonprofit I care about, acquire this land? So we wrote a recoverable grant. It was very short. It turned out that there was an aha moment or something happened at the state of Oregon's in their budget. And about 3 weeks after the funds were deployed from the DonorAdvised Fund account and the land was purchased, the money came back into that donor's account, and the state had provided, those funds for that purpose. So that's a great story that is somewhat COVID related, but an opportunity for people to realize that through grant making, impact, can be made. And this donor was very, very pleased. And of course, the nonprofit is thrilled because they have the capacity to scale up, which is exactly what they need to do, particularly given the demand now through COVID.
Thanks so much, Susan. So I know we're already at 11:45 Pacific time, and folks, I want to give some time to the lots of questions that we have streaming in. So I'll jump directly to those, and I'll try to pinpoint specific individuals if you're able to answer them. Otherwise, maybe there'll be a few that'll open it up to the whole group of panelists. So the first is around the actual pilot. So specifically, maybe I'll target this to Tanya, James. Are you focused exclusively on recoverable grants, and how are you curating and prioritizing thematic issue areas? Maybe James, you can start first.
sorry, I just want to make sure I'm unmuted there. We are focusing exclusively on recoverable grants in this pilot. We're using the pilot to really drill down into recoverable grants and define them. You know, when we started, we looked around the industry and around from private foundations to community foundations to large DAF sponsors. We found there's very little consistency on how recoverable grants were used, when they were used, what is their best use case scenario, how they're accounted for, how the grantees accept them, and how the grantees account for them. So we decided we really wanted to dive in deep to the recoverable grants and make sure that this is a tool that we can build and really offer our donors and feel confident in knowing what it is, why we use it, and when we use it, and have that be very clearly articulated to our donors to be able to, again, add that tool to the toolbox to increase impact investing. Was there a second part of the question? Sorry, I forgot. Besides, was it just
thematic. You know, how are you curating and prioritizing thematic issue areas?
So our thematic issuers, we started with COVID lens because when we began this recoverable grant pilot is right around the time the start of COVID. We layered on top of that the foundation strategic initiative areas of affordable housing, early childhood education. And then we also went out to donors and we said, you know, what are you interested in? And we did focus groups and asked our donors, what are the issues that they care about? So it's been a collaborative effort over time, taking a look at, you know, what's happening in the moment, you know, what is the foundation's own goals and own intentions, and what is it that our donors demand? And, you know, really pulling those three sources together and say, you know, what is the most effective offering that we can provide our donors, both what we think is going to make the most impact, but also what our donors are asking for and what our donors care about to make sure we meet that demand.
And we're thinking about piloting both impact loans and recoverable grants. We believe that they may be targeted and suitable for different audiences. One of the things that is really important to us with our impact investing strategy is that there be something for everyone. We don't want impact investing to be limited to the largest DAFs, but we also know that we need to hit minimums. Generally speaking, we've seen $1 million minimums to get into a specific investment. So we're looking to be able to bring in both the $1,000 contributions as well as the 100,000 or 500,000, depending on the size of the DAF. So we believe that recoverable grants may be easier to explain to the larger DAFs. And they also might have greater ability to absorb the risk of any of that not being recovered at the end of the term, whereas the impact investment, or the impact loan, I should say, we think would be easier to explain to kind of the everybody else, from the $1,000 DAF all the way on up. So that's part of our test strategy, is to look at both of them side by side and see if we can find a niche for each of them. In terms of the thematic areas, we have been really digging deep into our grant history, our grant making history, and understanding where our funders' interests lie, how much of that is Bay Area, how much of that is Jewish versus more broadly health and human services. A lot of that clearly happening right now in COVID. And so as a thematic set of priorities, we're looking at affordable housing, economic opportunity, small business relief, and then probably environment as a fast follow. But we believe a thematic approach will allow us to put something out that resonates with people because it relates to their history of grant making and the interests that they have demonstrated.
Thank you both. The next question, I think, can be open to any one of you. So this is really around, how do you balance profitability versus impact? So I'd love to hear many of the panelists about how they are thinking about this.
Hemali, is that profitability for the DAF sponsor or rate of return on the investment?
I would imagine it's rate of return on the investment.
Well, I think that.
Go ahead, Bert.
I'll just, generally it's up to each investor. Every organization and every individual has a different set of objectives of what they're trying to accomplish, where that source of money is coming from, and what that pot of money needs to generate or not. So, I mean, in my experience, it's very individualistic and can be all over the range.
And from our perspective at Fidelity Charitable, again, if we think about the two avenues, direct investments through an impact lens versus grant making with an impact strategy. On the investment side, our donors generally, since they've set aside these assets for philanthropic donations, my experience is that many donors are actually much more conservative with these assets and not willing to necessarily go out in duration or on the risk spectrum. And so their returns aren't necessarily concessionary. They can be market returns, but for a shorter period. And by shorter period, it could be 5 to 7 years, as opposed to the really short end of the curve. In terms of grants, generally speaking, I think the measurement of impact is something that has challenged the space, but I believe there are so many more resources now to help individuals ask the right questions to measure impact, to go back to those who they have either lent capital to or have funded through their specific grant making to guide it. At Fidelity Charitable, we don't do any activity following on the grant making, specifically in terms of measuring impact. That does rely on the donors, but we do have programs that allow our donors to use a philanthropic consultant for that purpose. And many of our donors actually are doing that, since we no longer necessarily think it's the greatest thing to fund an opportunity and then just walk away. People want to know, what did you do with it and what are the results of having that capital deployed, even if that is in a strict investment perspective, versus a grant perspective. But return, I don't think, is paramount, although it doesn't necessarily have to be concessionary. And since the opportunities with impact investments are becoming more market return oriented, I think investors no longer necessarily have to accept concessionary returns.
Thanks, Susan. And I can also speak a little bit from our DAF research that we did as part of our market research in our first phase. We saw the full spectrum of, there were definitely, individuals with DAF who are expecting sort of that market rate level of return because they are comparing it to the passive investments that they have in the market. And then there's the other side where, we have donors who already said this is already allocated towards charitable purposes. If I make an investment and I get 0% or I get less, I get partial recovery of capital, that's okay too, because this is already earmarked towards contribution. If it comes back, great. If not, that's okay as well. So I think we've seen sort of that full spectrum, and a lot of it comes down to how we're educating donors about this capital and how you're framing these opportunities. And so I think as another next question that I'll ask, and Tanya, you touched on this, but impact investing means so many different things to donors, right? And so how do we talk about it to our donors, and how do we educate them about the plethora of different things it could mean to them?
I'll step in there since I work so closely with our donors on that very topic. What has been very exciting, I think, is the interest in impact investing growing as a result of people becoming more aware of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. There's been a lot written on the alignment of the growth and impact investing with the SDGs. And so as our donors, particularly those who, as I mentioned, are engaging the next generation, realize that there is an opportunity out here, they need to learn, they need to understand better. And so we are actually educating both the advisor community as well as our direct donor community on what impact investing is, starting with the very basics. And for those that have already dipped their toe in the water, as we did a little over 5 years ago, giving them exposure to collaborative opportunities, like the Cap Shift or Calvert Impact Capital opportunities through CDFIs and and other opportunities. We also host a lot of webinars ourselves that are available to the advisor community for continuing education credit. There are many advisors, and I don't necessarily specifically reference investment advisors, although that's probably the bulk, but philanthropic advisors as well. There are many that have been out there for a long time and are responding to their clients' interest in the space. So we're trying to attack sort of the education to grow the activity in impact investing, both directly with our donors and through intermediaries that leverage DAFs or private foundations or other ways to fund impact investing, generally the advisor community, whether it's philanthropic advisors or investment advisors.
So in our last 3 minutes, I'll kind of ask a question I think that's in all of our minds, which is impact investing has been the quote unquote bleeding edge rather than mainstream. And so how can we change that? How can we make it the mainstream, whether it's for DAFs or otherwise?
I'll just jump in and say, that question is a little bit different for every person, depending on where you sit. But no matter where you sit, by speaking up and asking questions. If you are a donor, ask your community foundation or your DAF sponsor. Talk to your financial advisor. And if they say, yeah, we don't really do that, or you have to accept lower returns, we don't think it's appropriate, push back, ask questions. If you are within a foundation, ask your investments team, ask your investment committee, what are we doing to move impact investing? What are we doing to get more money into the community? If you are a nonprofit organization or a community member, go to your community foundation, go to your anyone else, private foundations, and ask, hey, this is the need. How can we use your capital and your resources to help meet our mission? So really the question is, no matter where you sit, is just asking the question, saying, why are we doing what we're doing and how can we do it better? How can we use the tools of finance to solve the problems that seem to be growing every day to meet the needs of our community? And just ask why and ask, can we use our capital differently and can we use our capital more efficiently?
And to build on what James just said, I would say from our perspective, start small and just start doing something. Figure out where the right entry point is based on what you understand of your donor base. What do they care about? What would resonate with them? How can you engage them in the conversation? And then just start doing, because by doing, that creates the opportunity to learn. Number one, we've had tremendous learnings over the past 6 months. But number two, you start to build momentum. You start to create visibility. And the more you do, the more people will pay attention, the more they will ask questions and engage. So we engaged 53 funders in our Hebrew free loan offering. We have 1,100 funds total. So we have plenty more that we can bring in to our next opportunity and the next one after that. So I think that this is one of those areas where you need to just start. And then once you start, you can build from there. And I think that's really where the momentum will grow.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add that I might push back a little bit on the fact that impact investing is not mainstream. I think that there are publicly traded funds, both fixed income and equity, both domestic and global, that have been offered by investment managers for years. I think it's an awareness of the fact that that's a strategy you can deploy to begin your impact investing plan personally. So whether you're looking to support the environment, if you're looking to fund microfinance organizations to support, women and children in countries and developing countries overseas, if you're looking to work in your individual community, I mean, there is a wide range. And so I would just, I just think that I agree with ask the questions. Because there are so many opportunities out there that have great track records. They have measurable impact to share with you. And if starting small is what you need to do to get started, just do it. Absolutely, Tanya. We are encouraging our donors to just do something. Don't sit on the sidelines.
Thank you all so much for participating. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to our attendees. I know we didn't get to even the tip of the iceberg with the number of questions that we had, but would love to continue the conversation, and don't hesitate to reach out to me or anyone else here who's on the panel with any of your follow-up questions. We'd love to chat with you and continue this conversation. So thank you all again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.